As great power competitions intensify with China and Russia, the Defense Department looks to add military capabilities. But rivalries remain stable and avoid war for a variety of reasons. Michael Mazarr is a senior political scientist at the Rand Corporation. His new co-authored report is called Stabilizing Great Power Rivalries. Mike, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
So can you start by defining for us what you mean by stability? Is it simply the absence of war?
That is a great question. And that's the question we really started with in this study. And ultimately, what we came to conclude was, if you're talking about a situation like U.S.-China, U.S.-Russia today, there are two big factors that help you define something that can remain stable and not go into constant crises, not go into war. And one of those is that you have a situation where both sides can live with a shared world that they both feel like meets their basic interests. We call it a shared status quo. And the other factor is that this relationship has enough inherent kind of equilibrium to recover from crises, so that, as in the Cold War, you can go into a crisis, but there's enough personal relationships, there's enough acceptance that going to war would be too dangerous, that they tend to come back to sort of a more stable equilibrium after that. So those are the two big factors that we think characterize a relationship that can be, what we call stable in the long term.
And you talk about strategic rivalry. How do you define that?
Yeah, so another great question. There's a lot of discussion these days about competition, right? We're in a strategic competition with China and Russia. The government in its different strategy documents has called it that. That's true. We are competing. But believe it or not, the term competition is not really very well defined if you look at international relations theory and history and other kind of sources of thinking about it. The term rivalry is a much more classic way of describing when two big powers have a long-term kind of clash of interests. And there's a lot of defining characteristics of that, but primarily it's two big powers who have a history of contestation of some kind, whether they've been at war or just in general in competition, that very much see themselves as, if not enemies, then strong competitors, and that engage in kind of a series of actions that are designed to gain a competitive advantage over the other one. And there's other factors, but just the idea that notion of rivalry is a little richer when we think about it from the standpoint of understanding what these things are all about.
So, Mike, really, the United States only has a strategic rivalry with China and Russia, not, say, North Korea, just because they're just not competitive enough.
Right. And so one of the, what you're getting at is one of the other defining aspect of rivalry is that they have to be sort of peers. They have to be more or less equal. And in fact, a lot of folks will say that we only really have one real rivalry, and that is with China, because as troublesome as Russia is, as we are seeing now, and as much as it believes itself to be a great power, and by some definitions it is, it's not really a rivalry because Russia's power is nowhere equal to the United States. So one way to look at it is that we really are in a rivalry with China, and then other countries, with Russia being a big one, but North Korea, Iran are sort of other strategic challenges for the United States, but not a peer rival.
So let's talk about China. Are we trending toward more instability, do you think?
Definitely, that was our finding. Now when we work on reports for the government, they take a while to clear. So the research on this finished up a bit more than a year ago. But our lead China scholar, Timothy Heath, one of our lead Rand China experts who did that part of the report, believes that very much we remain on the trajectory that we saw at that time. And that is, we laid out a dozen or so variables for judging whether a rivalry is stable or not. And the vast majority of those with China were headed in the wrong direction. And of course, we've seen all the hallmarks of that since that time in terms of trade disputes, in terms of U.S. confrontation of China over its ambitions over Taiwan and in the South China Sea. So yeah, we've definitely headed in a bad direction. And the thing that worries us is the lesson from the Cold War is you can build some stability, as we talked about. You can mitigate those risks with a number of sort of characteristics of a relationship. If you have senior leaders that have strong personal ties, if you have very good communication systems, if you have very good rules of the road so that everybody
Mike,
knows.
Sorry to cut you off, but I wanted to ask you about that specifically because President Biden met with Chinese leader Xi in November virtually. Did that help? Did that result in lessening the antagonism between the two countries?
So it did, in the sense that it, contributed to a continuing process of senior leader discussions that can help to dampen the severity of the competition. In and of itself, though, talking doesn't solve the clashes of interest. But when both sides, as they did, indicated at least a desire to try to keep the relationship stable, that establishes a baseline you can work from. So those kind of discussions are definitely helpful.
So, Mike, your report talks about the costs of aggression, right? Because of the economic interdependence of the two countries, we're talking about the U.S. and China, the cost of war is just too high for both sides. How likely is war or a misunderstanding, a miscalculation?
So it's hard to say. The cost of the conflict is a big factor, but unfortunately, there's a lot of historical cases that show that countries can kind of get themselves in a mindset that they can avoid those costs. I mean, Japan in 1941 knew they'd suffer immense destruction if the United States really went to war in response to Pearl Harbor, but they convinced themselves it wouldn't. So there's a lot of sort of inadvertent, accidental, misperception-oriented ways you can get to war, even despite the cost. Having said that, the combination of nuclear weapons, economic interdependence, it all creates a situation where, as far as we know, China is very interested in getting its objectives without going to war. So there's a baseline assumption that we should avoid it if we could, which offers some stabilizing ballast to this relationship.
Well, and speaking about Russia, though, there really isn't that strong economic tie that the U.S. has with Russia, where our economies are really not that interdependent.
No, exactly. And Russia's a little more so with Europe, as Europe has been in the last couple of months, a little more willing to talk about economic costs for a renewed intervention in Ukraine that can help deter conflict. But yeah, Russia is sort of outside of much of the world economy, networks of technology exchange and all that. So they have a little less to lose. On the other hand, an attack on an actual NATO ally, like in the Baltic states, would prompt a war with NATO. And of course, that has incalculable risk. So my view is that Russia will still want to, because of the cost of war, want to avoid steps like that. What they're threatening to do in Ukraine, they may feel like they can get away with it without those kinds of costs.
Climate experts, Mike, are always saying that the U.S. and China really have to cooperate on climate change. What do you think are the chances?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, the United States, this administration has been trying very hard to engage them. Both countries on their own are making independent decisions that don't involve sufficient action on climate. And then really, I think that the basic pattern we've seen over the last couple of years is that the United States has been approaching China on a range of areas to cooperate, not just climate, but North Korea and a variety of other things. And it has not been able to build all that much ongoing cooperation on these issues. The exact reasons for that, we're not really sure, but it's been very difficult so far.
So in going back to the U.S.-Russia relationship, the Russians are always saying that they're looking for respect, and you mentioned that in your report, that it's really, they're seeking respect from especially the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, and China is as well, quite frankly. And this is one of the trickiest things about, sort of the implications of our report and I think more generally for U.S. policy. On the one hand, we have to show strength, show credibility, indicate that certain actions won't be tolerated. On the other hand, our research, to me, shows pretty clearly that keeping a rivalry like this stable demands that we recognize some of the essential interests of the other side. We have to have a balance between sort of threats, sticks and carrots, so to speak. And that was true in the Cold War. It's been true in every rivalry that has not gone to war and has remained at least somewhat stable. So the challenge then becomes, how can you grant them some of the prestige and status that they're looking for in various ways, without creating a sense that of weakness and that they can pretty much do whatever they want because you're, in the mood of so-called appeasement. And that is the most essential balance that we've got to strike in policy toward both Russia and China.
Do you predict that the U.S.-Russia relationship will continue to get worse?
So I don't know. What's interesting right now is, based on the latest demands that Russia and Putin have given, it's a long list, in the context of this crisis over Ukraine. And clearly the United States and the West are not going to meet them all. But just recently, in the last couple of days, NATO has indicated that it's open to discussions. So if this process creates a new large-scale set of dialogues on kind of a transatlantic order, where, as I was just saying, we can offer Russia some assurances about, U.S. military deployments, about the extension of NATO, whatever, things that will address their interests. But they can also offer concessions and assurances that could bring the relationship to a much better place than it has been. I wouldn't put my money on it, because Putin has an interest in a hostile relationship with the West, but it is a glimmer of hope that those kind of talks can lead in a direction that becomes less crisis prone, more stable, and around the edges a little more cooperative.
And Mike, you recommend that the Pentagon think in terms of stabilizing a rivalry rather than just providing capabilities to threaten the adversary. How do they accomplish that shift in practical terms?
Yeah, so I think it's, one of the gratifying things is we get this question all the time from folks we work with in the Pentagon, of wanting to be able to develop new capabilities that are critical without provoking the other side or causing kind of risks of kind of escalatory spirals of hostility. So partly it relates to the kind of weapons you deploy. Do they put the other side under kind of immediate threat of short-term attack? Partly it depends on where you put them. Is it close to the other side? It depends on the context in which they occur, the goals that you're seeking. So there's a lot of criteria you can use to show strength, build up your own capabilities, but do it in a way that doesn't create unnecessary risk.
All right. Well, Mike, I appreciate you joining us. Thanks very much.
Sure. Nice to be with you.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.